إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. After spewing his famous objection against religion, that it teaches people to be happy with ignorance and not to even bother trying to understand those things that are claimed to have happened supernaturally, Dawkins goes on to say, science takes exactly the opposite approach. Science thrives on its inability so far to explain everything. Okay, look at what he claims that at some point it will be able to explain everything. He says, and uses that as the spur to go on asking questions, creating possible models and testing them so that we make our way inch by inch closer to the truth. If something were to happen that went against our current understanding of reality, scientists would see that as a challenge to our present model, requiring us to abandon or at least change it. It is through such adjustments and subsequent testing that we approach closer and closer to what is true. What would you think of a detective who, baffled by a murder, was too lazy even to try to work at the problem and instead wrote the mystery off as supernatural? The whole history of science shows us that things once thought to be the result of the supernatural, caused by gods, both happy and angry, demons, witches, spirits, curses, and spells, actually do have natural explanations. Explanations that we can understand and test and have confidence in. There is absolutely no reason to believe that things for which science does not yet have natural explanations will turn out to be of supernatural origin, any more than volcanoes or earthquakes or diseases turn out to be caused by angry deities, as people once believed they were. Okay, now, end quote. Now, suppose that your detective, Richard, happened one day to move to a distant planet in a distant galaxy, okay, where a highly advanced civilization of humanoid creatures have been thriving for 1,000,000 years or so. Let's presume, for the sake of the argument, that this were to happen one day, Yani. I trust it's quite the situation that you would love to find yourself in one day, right? Now, being totally alien to that civilization, to the culture and behavioral regularities that those creatures exhibit, and totally alien to the natures of motives or even the causes of death that they may or may not have, what would you think of him, that detective, if in sheer arrogance he insisted, as the good forensic scientist that he proclaims to be, to propose a theory, nonetheless, in explaining a murder that he bore witness to on that alien planet and did not write it off as profoundly supernatural? What do you think of him? If nature or natural is to be defined as that which fits with the regularities and behavioral laws and law-like beliefs he holds about the way such events unfold and the way sentient beings normally behave in particularly well-defined conditions, according to his knowledge, then obviously he wouldn't even hold a candle to what those laws might be in that new world, right? He and everything he knows about behavior and supernatural are supernatural to that world and to the sentient beings who inhabit it. Okay, he's unfamiliar with anything. Where from then would he produce his explanatory theory or hypotheses and then work them out through such IBE techniques he's been trained to use back on Earth as a forensic investigator, so he would come up with anything useful? Where from would that come? Would the hypotheses themselves emerge? What is the basic source material for any natural explanation, if not the natures and regularities a scientist has come to be familiar with in his own experience and the accumulated experience of his peers? You don't claim any revelation of some mystical or supernatural quality or for a scientist when he proposes explanations, Richard, do you? You don't, I suppose. You can't. So what is the source of epistemic authority that you draw upon when you state so confidently, as a matter of unshakable faith, that there is absolutely no reason to believe that things for which science does not yet have natural explanations will turn out to be of supernatural origin? What's the grounds for that belief? What scientific evidence can you present for such a statement? The level of ignorance and arrogance that this belief system that Dawkins champions here and the rest of his books is really staggeringly pathetic, brothers and sisters. So much so, you find it difficult to decide where to begin to expose its falsehood. By its very nature, this is not a scientific claim, obviously. It's a philosophical belief about science and the human ability to learn about the truth of all reality through it. Believe it or not, Dawkins, it's not only a childish, unwarrantable belief in the eyes of people of religion like myself here, it is so even in the eyes of many naturalistic philosophers that are every bit as atheist as you are. Scientific realism is notoriously a belief that cannot be proven true. And a version of it that is as bigoted and close-minded as yours is even more shameful a position, even in the eyes of atheists who have even the least level of acquaintance with philosophical literature. It is quite disturbing how a biologist or a zoologist like this guy here would make such shameless statements of philosophy without ever feeling for a minute that they need to attempt to justify them somehow, or to ground them in anything reasonable. Just being a scientist is enough, they seem to think. Okay? When you make a claim about fundamental beliefs as such, then you either hold it to be self-evident, innately true, in which case you would strive to defeat all opposing claims in the most powerful forms of argumentation an intellectual author can present, and thus you would stand justified in ridiculing your opponent, as you usually do, Dawkins, or you hold it to be propositionally valid and rationally sound, in which case you would propose your theoretical arguments. Your theoretical arguments for its validity in a way that suits the kind of claim that it is and the subject matter it addresses. Never in any of Dawkins's writings, as literally colorful as they are, have we seen him as much as attempt either of these two modes of argumentation for his case. Of course, that's in assuming that the issue that he's arguing for can be achieved through theoretical argumentation. It's not an issue of theoretical proposition and assumption, but that's another story. I mean, we've never seen him attempt an argumentation at all in the sense that people would really find useful. Never. Okay, not once. Science is good because it's science. Okay, can you disagree with me? Science is beautiful, science is great, and that's it, brothers and sisters. Can you not see that? Can you not agree with me that science is marvelous, that science is doing wonders in the world? Okay? Do you not agree that we know now more about the natures of matter than we did hundreds of years ago? Then obviously it is only a matter of time before we've learned all there is to learn about the unseen, about reality. It's only a matter of time. Okay? It must be the case that science progresses in all fields of technology and application precisely because our underlying metaphysical assumptions about reality are true. The unseen ontology by which we explain everything must be true. Otherwise, why would there be progress at all? Now, I would accept such a question from a student of philosophy of science as the question of someone who is new to the field and who wishes to learn about it. Okay? Not aware of the intricacies there is in the literature. Now, Dawkins and like-minded authors, however, do not even recognize the field to begin with, the field they're ignorant about. The answer is so readily clear and unequivocal, it would be unthinkable that someone should take the question seriously. Of course, we're inching towards total and complete knowledge about everything. One theory at a time, one piece at a time, one step at a time, inch by inch. How can you not see that? The analogy he provided seems to him to do the job perfectly well. It's sufficient. It does it. It shows it to be the case. The analogy of the detective. Would you accept his answer if one day he just blurted out, "There's no natural explanation for this murder"? Absolutely not. Why? Because, he says, we once thought that volcanoes were the outcome of the wrath of gods, and now we don't. We know what causes volcanoes to happen. We know it now. I don't, however, see how all those explanations that geologists have devised for volcanoes throughout the last century or so would defeat the claim from any follower of any given religion at all about the underlying cause, the unobservable cause for things to be this way rather than otherwise in terms of natural regularities. I'm not arguing for any god of the gaps here. I'm only examining the kind of rationale that this claim relies upon. This metaphysical belief about causation and its ultimate source. The fact that you all have chosen to produce theories about reality and the reason existing things are the way they are, based on the belief that only matter as known to you exists in the world, and only natural causes, the likes of which you're familiar with, should be proposed to explain anything at all, or as he so childishly puts it, explanations that we can understand and test and have confidence in, is merely an arbitrary choice of metaphysical belief. Okay, from the bottom up. It's, as I've endeavored to show in this series of lectures, every bit as blind an article of false faith as the belief that the world was born in the vomit of the African god Bumba. It merits no more epistemic credit or respect just because it happens to be embraced by the greatest majority of scientists in the world today. It does not. I'm sorry. Merit comes from justification, brothers and sisters, and this belief simply cannot have any. Everything has to be such that the unseen causes for it, every single one of them, as many as there may be, is easy for me, the scientist, to understand at some point in the future, and to even replicate and test at my own will, at least potentially. Okay, I chose to believe that there's nothing more to reality than those things I can't fit in my simple analogy, or someone like me can do in the future, can do so, if not me, yani. To my eyes, this is nothing more than the wishful thinking of a foolish child, a child who refuses to leave the candy store no matter what. The Greek ethos of theory, the zeitgeist of the academy, so to speak, since its inception has been that, as I explained in previous parts of this material, that there always needs to be a theory, has to be some theory, some claim to epistemic authority that does not leave room for any challenge of any kind from any other source of knowledge man can conceive. The theory has to hold true, not because of the epistemic warrant that it actually has, but because the alternative to it would be unthinkable for the philosopher, socially speaking. That's where the academic imperative for there being a theory at all, some theory, really comes from. There has to be a theory because the alternative would be for him, this philosopher, to submit to somebody else besides himself, for him to become the follower rather than the one who is followed. People have to continue taking his explanations on faith, believing that empirical evidence does justify it as he claims, whatever the subject matter is, because if they don't, then the answers to the big questions about existence that define what everything is all about would not be up to him to make up. He wouldn't be the one who teaches them to the world. Okay? The natural philosopher and the metaphysician, now known as the scientist, okay, must have all the answers, actually, or at least potentially, because the alternative is something we all hate, we the philosophers. Thus it became a central value to the academy that whoever tells the scientist to cease and desist, especially on grand questions about the cosmos at large, and about the origins and the fate of man in particular, is asking people to accept ignorance rather than pursue knowledge in this respect, bravely and heroically and the likes. But wouldn't it be ignorant to come up with fictional narratives and unjustifiable analogies about reality and insist on calling that science and knowledge, despite the fact that none of it can, in fact, be warranted by the evidence they claim to have for it? Yes, indeed it would. Muslim scholars would call that complex ignorance al-jahl al-murakkab, to come up with unwarranted claims, unwarrantable claims, and insist you have reasonable evidence for them, when in fact you don't, is to indulge with complex arrogance, that is, claiming to know something and not knowing that you actually don't know it. That's the worst arrogance of all, the worst kind of arrogance there is, brothers and sisters, because when you admit that you don't know, then you're willing to sit your bottom down and learn from those who do know. Okay? That's hardly the case here. What you claim to be science in such issues is indeed ignorance of the worst kind imaginable. Okay? So when we tell you guys to quit trying to come up with answers to such questions as the question of origins of all things, for example, we're not asking you to accept ignorance. No, on the contrary, we're trying to snatch you out of it. Okay? Assuming the theory of magma chambers to be true, accepting it does not, by any means, exhaust all possible causes that underlie the entire process of a volcano in nature. Accepting it does not dismiss other explanations in addition to it. Okay, other causes, I mean, in addition to those causes. those presumed causes. There still are causes for those chambers to behave the way they do anyway, and causes for the natures of matter that result in such a systematic behavior to hold as they do. Of course there are. Okay? Whatever those natures might be, they are the way they are because necessarily someone chose for them to be that way rather than otherwise, and has made it so. Okay? Obviously, if you insist that other natures in other matter acted as the fundamental cause for those natures you observe to be the way that they are, okay, then you're inviting an infinite regress. You have to end up in an ultimate lawgiver or an arbiter of all natures, or none of the explanations you propose, whatever they may be, would make any sense at all. Okay? Natural or otherwise. Someone with will, knowledge, and ultimate power must have preponderated those natures and have chosen to keep them for as long as they see fit. All causes have to come from that single ultimate will and no other, with no partner in this causal origin, for the world to make any sense at all, for things to continue to work at all. So, whatever natural explanation a scientist proposes for anything at all will only be yet another step in an infinite regress that defeats the entire notion of causation altogether if that ultimate arbiter of all natures did not exist. Okay? But we do have order, and we do have consistency in all natures, and we do have purpose and functionality, obviously, overarching all natures there are. We do have metaphysical teleology, as much as a biologist would hate to admit it. That's not me attempting a metaphysical explanation for observable things being the way that they are, like a philosopher would. No. That's me challenging the entire enterprise of metaphysics with a statement of self-evident facts about the ultimate cause of all causes. The one cause for all causes to make any sense at all, or to hold true, potentially, if not actually. Okay? Of all possible ways that matter could have been like in this world, one way holds true. One way holds true. You can't have an infinite regress of natural causes for this to be the case. Proposing the set of all possibilities in the world to be a set of actual worlds, a multiverse of which our universe just happens to be one, is not a plausible theory about reality, because some would think of it as a way out of that implication. No, it's not. It's a silly attempt by an atheist metaphysician to drown the question rather than face it head on. Because then again, there would still be the obvious question, by whose leave or authority or choice are we to be this kind of creatures in this particular world rather than another kind in another world? Okay? Who puts who where? Who chooses for those particular identities that we have to emerge here and now rather than elsewhere and in another time? Obviously, there is no escaping an ultimate will that ends the regress of all causes, even if one were to assume the proclaimed infinite multiverse to be true. There is no binding law that whatever can happen must happen. There is no such law. Must happen where, when, and more essentially, why. Okay? The set of all possible events is not such that any member of it may just take incidence randomly at any time or place. You cannot even begin to imagine what a fundamentally random universe may look like because you've obviously never experienced one before. A universe where no two events are related by a common cause or a standard order or a systematic function, where no order at all is kept or observed, is one that not only does not exist but cannot exist. This is simply an issue of rational impossibility. Nature, by its very definition, is order. And order is given and kept, okay, purposefully. It cannot come from dead matter. Ontological chaos cannot produce order. There can be no such thing as ontological chaos or randomness at all. Without order and a willful giver of that order, there can be no world or universe in existence. Okay? The willfulness and wisdom of the giver, keeper, sustainer of all natures is not a fine-tuning argument conjured up by some theologian or apologist to justify their beliefs. No, it's the reason why things make sense at all in the world. Why science is possible to begin with. Why there is a world at all. Why is nature. And what is nature anyway? What is nature? How would you define nature? Nature is simply the observation that things continue to exhibit today the same properties they used to in the past in our experience with them in terms of causes and effects, right? Okay, but why should they? Why should they? Why should they continue to hold? Obviously, things change. Everything is moving. Everything we observe is changing. It's the way of all things around us, isn't it? And yet, our experience tells us that change has rules to govern it. Rules that could easily have been different. Rules that only hold contingently rather than necessarily. To explain that perfect consistency and orderliness of change and motion by nature is to claim that merely giving something a label or inventing a term for it would provide a sufficient explanation for it. Scientists do that all the time. Nature does not do anything, brothers and sisters. It does not create anything. It does not select anything. Nature would only be the repeated habit of things repeating in that manner. Okay? The ongoing habit of things repeating in that manner. Nothing more. Of such order holding the way that it does, the habit of that. It's the process itself, not the doer or keeper of the process. That's what nature is. You can't pretend to have terminated the need to provide the ultimate explanation for that entire order, whatever it happens to be like, simply by labeling it nature. Okay, that doesn't work. That obviously doesn't work. You're not getting away with such a cheap trick. I'm sorry. Nothing turned out not to be caused by any deity or God just because we managed to observe certain orders to be related causally or systematically in the world. Just because a button on your smartphone was designed such that whenever you click it, an image is captured or of whatever happens to be in front of the camera at that moment. Just because that's the case doesn't make that button and the process by which the image is captured the only explanation anybody needs for why an image at all is captured by that phone or by the phone holder, or why phones were designed in such a manner rather than otherwise, or why the matter from which the phone itself was created exists at all. Okay. Atheism is indeed the doctrine that forces people into untold, unimaginable ignorance, not theistic religion. There is a necessary limit to the explanation that science can provide, no matter how advanced it ever gets to be. Obviously, there's a limit. And no matter how much progress it enjoys over time, there are issues where it can never progress, or questions it can never answer, or get any nearer to the truth than it ever was. I mean, what is light? For example, what is light? As much as we like to think we have a final revealing answer to that question today that we didn't have before, we actually don't. Of course, we know quite a few things about how light behaves in different circumstances that people from 2 centuries ago did not know. Okay, but that's not an answer to the question, what is the fundamental, ultimate reality of what light is? Photons are not the answer. Waves are not the answer. Those are just analogies proposed to facilitate studying its behavior in different settings. Light is not both a wave and a particle. It's rather something that only behaves as though it were a wave under certain conditions and as though it were a particle under others. But what is it really? What is it? We have no idea. We have to admit that we have no idea. Okay? I'm making even a stronger claim here. We will never know what light really is. One metaphor may work today, another may work tomorrow in its place, but they all remain arbitrary metaphors that only make the phenomenon easier to study and to model and to follow, okay, to predict. We've never had a revelation about the unobservable fundamental reality of light, or of electricity, or of heat, or of magnetism, or of sound, or of gravity, or of anything at all for that matter. All we have is a compendium of carefully organized and well-accorded metaphors that produce useful models, which in turn provide us with good predictions about the regularities that we observe. That's it. That's what science does here. At one point in history, the analogy to a planet orbiting the sun seemed to work perfectly well in organizing, categorizing, and interrelating the different observations and regularities we knew at the time about the so-called atom and its behavior. At the time, it seemed to make sense to explain what we observed by that proposed image. Okay? So, have we come to a point today where we know that there is no fixed orbit where a consistent particle is normally revolving around the nucleus of the atom, whatever that actually is, in that manner? No, we can't say so. The best that we can say is that that simplistic analogy is no longer as helpful as it once was to us, given the experimental progress we've had since the time it was proposed in studying the behavior of whatever it is that we saw that the so-called atom is made of, if indeed it is at all made of anything. We cannot even provide a definitive answer to the question, are atoms really spheres with voids in between, or is it merely the effect of the instruments we devised to test them and observe them that make them behave as though they are spheres with spaces in between? After all, if the only device you can use to observe something is such that whenever you use it, it alters the true image or form or shape of the very thing it is supposed to observe, then there can be no way for you to truly observe it as it normally is when you're not looking at it, right? I mean, this alone is such a troubling question to quantum theorists who adopt scientific realism one way or another, to the extent that someone like Albert Einstein was notoriously quoted at some point to have said, "I like to think that the moon is there when I'm not looking at it." Of course, what he meant was the problem with quantum realism, okay? The entire problem of measurement in quantum interpretation theory just goes away if you let go of the Neoplatonic realism that is adopted by many of its theorists with respect to the wave function equation. Ground yourself into believing it to actually be nothing more than a wave of calculated probabilities for obtaining a certain observation by the instruments devised for the measurement, and you will immediately see the problem that Schrödinger so famously represented by his cat and box thought experiment. You'll see that problem just disappear. There can be no such thing as something that is simultaneously X and not X when it is not observed. That just doesn't make sense. The law of contradiction is not a contingent law that may or may not hold true to our world, or to some parts of it, or some scale of it. Okay? It holds true by necessity in every possible world. Okay, wouldn't a more reasonable ontology here then be to propose that there really is no such thing as an electron that exists as a particle when no observation is taking place, and that only due to the way that we make our observations, technically speaking, does it get to look and behave like one, like a particle? Perhaps it's not a particle at all, just a field of some sort that only condensates one way or another with certain measurable properties when the so-called measurement occurs. Just because we assumed it to be real and built our entire standard model upon that assumption in prediction, explanation, and various fields of application doesn't imply, in fact, that it has to be real. I mean, the entire ontology of what we call an electron, that is. Okay? Some realist philosophers like Hilary Putnam would argue here that it would be a miracle if indeed all such successful explanations and interpretations of experiments and practical applications involving the electron obtained when indeed there was no such thing as an electron in reality at all, or at least not in the way that physicists would describe it. The negatively charged particle that has so-and-so mass and behaves in this or that way. This, however, is not an argument that has gone uncontested in the literature, the so-called the argument from miracle, okay, or the miracle argument for realism. There are indeed numerous objections to it. The most obvious objection, in my view, would be that the history of science shows us countless cases of theories that achieved success on all such counts and enjoyed a very happy consensus among academic scientists for centuries until the tides changed for them and they were eventually superseded with other theories. In many such cases, the shift was not actually due to a failure of the theory replaced, but rather due to the exceeding appeal that the new theory and its ontology enjoys compared to the old one. A case in point here would be, in my view, the shift from Newtonian mechanics to Einsteinian mechanics. Nobody can argue in any compelling way that Newtonian mechanics have failed, especially given the fact that both of Einstein's theory of relativity and the special and the general employ some of Newton's equations anyway. I mean, even the arguments from better explanatory power can be challenged by the fact that alternative explanations have in fact been proposed within the Newtonian paradigm for the curvature of light, and that the precision in Mercury's orbit can be accounted for with a very little tweak to the inverse square equation. That those modifications to the theory do exist, and it still holds. So there really is no miracle in a theory succeeding in a variety of ways for hundreds of years without its ontology actually being true. There isn't. The point I'm making here, brothers and sisters, is that it is profoundly naive to take the inching towards the truth dictum as an argument against supernatural explanations the way that this author does on every chance that he gets. Hopefully you can clearly see now how ignorant he shows himself to be when he says, the whole history of science shows us that things once thought to be the result of the supernatural actually do have natural explanations. It's ridiculous and vacuous on so many levels, it is almost hard to cover them up all elaborately in the context of these lectures. I do aspire to finish responding to this book sometime soon, after all, may Allah provide. Okay? It's funny how he speaks of what scientists would do when something challenges their models, admitting that sometimes they would abandon them altogether, in the favor of entirely new models with an entirely different ontology, or at least almost entirely different ontology, and yet he would insist that in doing so, they would decidedly be approaching the truth in their proposed ontologies every time they make such a shift. When you change the entire model, altering the core metaphysical assumptions underlying it, you effectively adopt an entirely different worldview. Okay? Einstein's gravitation, for example, is a different story altogether from Newton's view of what gravity really was. His space-time is profoundly different from the ether theory of the 19th century. Okay, although at some point he eventually did admit that it looks quite a lot like an ether, and in fact he did call it an ether in some of his writings and letters and correspondences, but that's besides the point here. He did propose an entirely different view of how things work in nature. Okay, the unobservables, I mean, underlying reality, the observed reality. He did not come closer to the truth, replacing the previous ontology with his own as he did. No, he unseated the previous science and proposed another in its place. He took a hit at the problem. He took a different hit at the problem, all anew. Okay? A hit that is supposedly as likely to hit as it is to miss, that is. Okay? Now, the gamble in every such case in the history of science, scientific revolution, that is, was thus: if either the new model is true, as opposed to its false predecessor, or the new model is false, despite being more convenient empirically, okay, as opposed to the true model it is proposed to replace, or both are indeed false. Okay, those are the three possibilities here. Now, in none of these three possibilities does any actual progress happen, obviously, in terms of approaching the complete truth about the unseen reality, inch by inch, as this author wishes to convince himself. The discovery of a new regularity in nature through proper induction, or of a new application of an old one, or of the discovery of facts previously unknown or unobserved, particularly, is in principle warrantable is epistemic progress. There's no disputing that. This is a discovery, as in the manner that I described. The same, however, is not true of scientific revolutions of the kind that he describes, abandoning the model in favor of a new one. Okay, that's a shift, that's a change in science. That's not an addition to it, it's an alteration. It's a replacement. Okay, and that's why philosophers found it hard to describe it as a replacement. They felt bad about doing so, so they had to use a word that's really neither here nor there, a weasel word. They called it superposition. Superposition? What exactly is superposition? It's a replacement. Okay, one way or another. All right. It might, in fact, share some mutual notions about reality, of course, as it usually would. But it is a replacement. It's a different ontology. It's a new metaphysical view of what the unobservables there are underlying the phenomena that you are trying to explain. Okay. So when he makes the happy statement, it is through such adjustments and subsequent testing that we approach closer and closer to what is true, you can only laugh at his ignorance of how science really works. He has no idea what he's talking about. In some cases, the detective he spoke of would be fully justified in declaring that the problem he faces cannot be solved by any means or tools at his disposal, as in the case of the extraterrestrial murder case that I described earlier. In fact, he should be lamented if he attempted to solve such a problem. Okay? Laziness is when you decide not to work on something when indeed you have to. You're only lazy if you're not working on a problem that you are required to solve for no morally plausible reason. Okay? You're not working it for you're abandoning it for no morally plausible reason. I'm not being lazy when I decide to quit working on the question of the origins of the universe, for example, first because there is no moral obligation for me to seek an answer to it in astrophysics. Okay? Anybody who claims such a duty or obligation is more than welcome to present his case and show us what kind of moral argument he or she could possibly come up with in his favor. I would really be interested to see that. Okay? I would really be interested to see what kind of an argument that would be like. The only commitment that the Western Academy has for working on such a question is, as I elaborated in earlier parts of this material, due to the Greek value of metaphysical theory in its very principle. The Academy needs to have a theory or a corpus of theories that provide some form of revelation about all of existence, all of reality, because if it didn't, then the philosopher would then be reduced to yet another mere mortal who needs to follow somebody else for salvation. Okay? The rationally sound stance here, though, is that some questions are indeed epistemically inaccessible, okay, to the tools of science, the scientific method, no matter how much a philosopher would like to think otherwise, and only through revelation from a true prophet or messenger from the Creator of all things could we aspire to learn any true knowledge about them, if indeed we need to. They are inaccessible, and any theory thereabouts would necessarily be indeterminate by observation. Indeterminable by observation. Indeterminable. Okay? Because we've never seen a world come into being, or a universe as it gets created with all its matter, okay, all its natures and its regularities, either from nothing at all or from something else. We've never seen that. So any scenario our friend the detective would propose here would be nothing but arbitrary conjecture. Okay, arbitrary conjecture. One that presupposes methodological naturalism, in the sense that you can only extrapolate the laws of nature as we know them today to encompass all of existence and to hold true all the way back to infinity in the past, as all physicists normally would. If you know for a fact in advance that only natural events, natural causes, natural processes have ever existed or have ever been taking place in existence. Okay, you have to presuppose that knowledge. Not only would you be lying if you claimed that to actually know that, okay, it is by necessity a false belief if you exhibit it. As I explained earlier, natures are necessarily given to things, arbitrated by a willful order of contingent things. They cannot themselves be the outcome of higher or more fundamental natures, because obviously the giver of natures does not need to mediate other natures between his divine action and the initial establishment of natures in all forms of contingent matter. Doing with no need or for no plausible end at all is foolish, and he is necessarily too wise for that. Okay? Of course, he does not do for need, out of need, but out of purpose. And if there is no purpose, there is no doing. Okay? He's wiser than that. Besides, it would clearly be circular to hold that nature was created by nature, or that all systematic process in the world was only the outcome of yet another systematic process. Okay? The regress cannot hold for infinity, obviously. There has to be an uncaused cause, a source of natures who is not himself natural, or a nature, okay? Some worldly nature, some law of the world, or of fundamental law of nature, or something like that. No, of course he cannot have been that. Thus it follows that if by science we mean the study of nature, then the question of the origins of nature itself is by necessity not one that should fall within the scope of science. Right? This is one example of a topic that no natural philosopher should be allowed to theorize about. Okay? A case of historical events where no cause or effect can be classified as natural. Okay, cosmogony is by definition the province of religion, not of science. Okay, and the funny thing is that in the 19th century, at the start of geology and related sciences, okay, and many academics and philosophers in Britain did in fact treat cosmogony as a religious subject. It was supposed to be. They fought to prevent scientists or geologists from actually addressing that issue in any way for some time, until eventually the defenses crumbled. Anyway, the author goes on to say, of course, no one really believes that it would be possible to turn a frog into a prince. Or was it a prince into a frog? I can never remember. Or a pumpkin into a coach. But have you ever stopped to consider why such things would be impossible? There are various ways of explaining it. My favorite way is this. Frogs and coaches are complicated things, with lots of parts that need to be put together in a special way, in a special pattern that can't just happen by accident, or by a wave of a wand. That's what complicated means. It is very difficult to make a complicated thing like a frog or a coach. To make a coach, you need to bring all the parts together in just the right way. You need the skills of a carpenter and other craftsmen. Coaches don't just happen by chance or by snapping your fingers and saying abracadabra. A coach has structure, complexity, working parts, wheels and axles, windows and doors, springs and padded seats. It would be relatively easy to turn something complicated like a coach into something simple, like Ash, for instance, the fairy godmother's wand would just need a built-in blowtorch. Okay, it is easy to turn almost anything into ash, but no one could take a pile of ash or a pumpkin and turn it into a coach, because a coach is too complicated. And not just complicated, but complicated is in a useful direction. In this case, useful for people to travel in. Let's make it a bit easier for the fairy godmother by supposing that instead of calling for a pumpkin, she had called for all the parts you need for assembling a coach, all jumbled together in a box, a sort of IKEA kit for a coach. The kit for making a coach consists of hundreds of planks of wood, panes of glass, rods and bars of iron, wads of padding and sheets of leather, along with nails, screws, and pots of glue to hold things together. Now suppose that instead of reading the instructions and joining the parts in an orderly sequence, she just put all the bits into a great big bag and shook them up. Okay, what are the chances that the parts would happen to stick themselves together in just the right way to assemble a working coach? The answer is effectively zero. And part of the reason for that is the massive number of possible ways in which you could combine the shuffled bits and pieces, which would not result in a working coach or a working anything. End quote. Okay, now this brilliant analysis, brothers and sisters, would only amount for an argument against his strict naturalism rather than an argument for it as he seems to think it does. Obviously, the creation of something as complicated as a coach or a frog is not such that it could come about without the necessary information to place every part of it in its right place, in accord with the predetermined natures in the matter of which every part is made. Without that information, the will and the power in a personal maker, there can be no creation of these things or bringing them into existence. Okay? Now, thanks, Dawkins. I couldn't have put it better, really. Good job defeating your entire belief system, man. Your objection, thus, is only against the probability of these things coming into being in that way for such a cause, for such a simple cause. In particular, the waving of a wand, as you named it. And thus, the response would simply be this. Granted, there is not a single case in our experience where something as such, the waving, the creation of a coach or a frog, did happen from such a cause, the waving of a wand. Nobody has ever seen that. But all that this amounts to is small probability, very small probability, not impossibility, not rational impossibility as you're seeking to show. So at the end of the day, all you have shown is that it is quite unlikely that one day someone would wave around a wand and actually turn a human being into a frog or a pumpkin into a coach. Okay. By no means would this be a proper premise to establish however, the rational impossibility of it ever taking place, not to mention the impossibility of there being real magic or spirits or demons or deities, etc., as people from different religions would believe, of course a wizard or a witch would never have the knowledge, the wisdom, or the power to create a frog from anything at all. Yet it could come to pass in the realm of rational possibility that a human being be given one cause for such an act of creation, whereas the rest of the causes be assembled for that act to happen by the Creator of all things himself, after his will and his leave, and by his command. Okay? There's no rational reason why this couldn't happen. Allah tells us in the Quran that He told Jesus to create clay figures of birds, and He would turn them by His will and power of creation into real birds. Okay, miracles as such would not be a display of divine power in the Prophet himself, but rather a display of the power of the one who sent him, and by whose authority He set out to invite His people to follow Him. Okay? It wasn't due to Moses' intrinsic powers that the sea was split by the hit of his cane, or due to Muhammad's personal abilities that the moon was split in two. No. They were only instructed to do simple acts that only by the will and power of their Maker were they turned into causes for such major outcomes. Okay? Such bombastic outcomes. This notion of causing or causation is not by any means alien to the way that anything at all happens after a certain cause or due to it, brothers and sisters. Did you think, Dawkins, that when you get up from your seat and walk to the door to open it, the door in your room, then your will and your actions were the only causes there are for that event to unfold? Of course not. Obviously not. Obviously there are countless events that should also be brought about or made to happen outside of your knowledge and your control, such that your actions would yield the desired outcome. The causes for gravity to work in your convenience have to hold while you get up and move towards the door. You're not the one keeping those causes in check now, are you? The causes for your blood pressure to maintain normal flow in your veins such that you don't faint as soon as you spring out of your chair have to be brought about in the process too, and you're not the one who controls that either. The causes for the matter of which the floor is made to remain intact under your feet as you walk to the door also have to hold, and that's not up to you either. The causes for your muscles to work normally as you're used to, and your nervous system as you stretch out your arm to grab the doorknob are not up to you either. The causes for the natures of the matter from which the knob itself is made to hold while you use it are not your creation, not by your power or by your will or any of these causes, and countless others of which you know next to nothing, for the completion of such a simple action brought about. Not by your power or your will are they brought about. A prophetic miracle is no different in that sense. A prophet would only be told to take just one simple action from his part that would be but one cause among countless others that only the Lord, the Maker of all things, has the existential authority to bring about in perfect accord for the miracle to happen after His will. We don't create our actions or the outcomes that follow from them. We choose to act, we proceed to act, our actions are thus our own. But those actions, like everything else, are thereby created solely by the Creator of everything, not by ourselves. Complete causation is the province of divine action, of creation and divine providence, not of human action. Whenever we create something, no matter what that something is or how simple it is, we create it by actions that are not our own creation. We employ causes that are but a tiny part of a vast plethora, a vast set, a vast a tapestry of causes that are not under our control. Even what we do control is not our creation. We're not the ones causing the atoms of our hands, if there really is such a thing as an atom, to work in accord with our will to grasp the knob when we do decide to open the door, or causing the atoms of the knob itself to follow those orderly natures that make it possible for us to grasp it at all and move it around. Our bodies are not following our will because we create that physical submission every time we will for something to happen and set out to make it happen. No, they're following our will, exhibiting causal power and the ability to affect other things around us one way or another, because the maker of all things has chosen for that to be, and is keeping the physics of the world, so to speak, in such a way that it would happen. This notion is central to our belief in the oneness of our Maker as the Lord of all things, الربوبية, توحيد الربوبية, and the source of all causes in existence, including those that come from our part as created creators. This is equally true whether the actions we take are just simple, trivial deeds like opening a door, or miraculous events of biblical scale like creating birds from clay figures, raising people from the dead. Nothing is really up to us at all in terms of ultimate and complete causation. There's a single created cause, there's a complete set of created causes, and an ultimate uncreated cause from which all creation and causation comes, and by whose power and will all causes work physically in producing the results. This is true of every event that happens in reality. Every event. No human action yields its results, or even comes to unfold at all to begin with, in reality, without a complete set of causes being created for it to happen. There is no such thing as divine intervention. Divine action is what keeps the world running, what keeps natures in things, and why the world continues to be at all. The notion of intervention, as Christian theologians would explain it, comes from a deistic belief system that takes Newton's metaphor of the universal machine literally. A realist stance to that metaphor, so to speak. A machine is obviously something that runs on its own with respect to human action. We create it and then we leave it to run according to the nature's constitutions and intrinsic properties of its species, and the way they are fit together. If ever we decide to do something about its work, something different, then we do it by means of intervention. We interrupt its process to change it somehow, either to fix it when it goes bad, or to add to it, or to alter it by will somehow, one way or another. Like walking into a factory where robots are programmed to run a production line of vehicles, for example, and deciding to change the color of one particular vehicle as it progresses on that production line in the middle of the process itself. That's intervention. Now, it's no surprise that following Newton's machine analogy, many philosophers started to think about divine action in the same manner, in the same sense. It became a matter of mathematical consistency and functional efficiency for that machine that no cause can come from outside of it, a non-Newtonian cause, so to speak, unless it's an intervention by the divine to do something that otherwise cannot happen from the normal workings of the machine itself. Thus, the Creator's work in creation was reduced to merely the making of that machine, and perhaps supplying it with the energy needed to keep it up and running, and that's it. That's Him being the Creator and the sustainer of all things. Apart from that, anything else would only be an intervention. Alright? So did Dawkins manage to demonstrate in this example of the frog and the coach that supernatural creation is rationally impossible? No, he did not. Rather, he demonstrated that denying will, knowledge, wisdom, and personal attributes to the ultimate source of this orderly creation would amount to a sheer fallacy. His defense, of course, would be his famous Mount Improbable argument, in which he would argue for a long chain of impossible events to gradually create these marvelous complexities we observe in living species. I say impossible events because the idea of a functional or useful mutation coming about by chance, ontological chance, as he believes, is profoundly irrational. No matter how small the change it causes in the physical constitution of members of a certain living species might be, that's information coming from absolutely nothing. There's information by which nature selects, according to his to the Darwinian definition of what a selection process is. That's information in both the natures of matter and the way that a living species behaves, the way that a living species is constituted, is built. That's information. There has to be the information of a lock and a key for the lock to be able to open the key, and that information is given. It does not emerge from nothing. It cannot emerge from nothing. Function from no giver of purpose, system from no arbiter of order, information from absolutely nothing. This is formidably irrational, because out of nothing, nothing comes. So no matter how many zeros you add up and no matter how long the chain of adding zeros gets, the outcome is always a big zero. It will never be any different. 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0, etc. is 0. Now, probability reasoning does not help him with this profound irrationality. Okay, if anything, it makes it even more irrational because by definition, probability is an estimate derived from previous human experience. Never in our human experience have we observed the origination of an entire biosphere from no existing instances of living beings. Never have we observed the emergence of a new system of organs and biological functions from mutations to an existing species either. And by that I mean the origination of an entirely novel system of biological functions that gives us the distinction between a bird and a reptile, for example. The entire scenario is fictional, on the assumption that this might have been the case, since we have indeed observed mutations altering certain properties in members of the same species. So the reasoning goes, given enough time, the impossible will be possible. But will it really? Is this a necessarily true statement about reality? Obviously not. It cannot. It's a clear contradiction. It's like saying, given enough time, contradiction will become valid. Contradiction, the invalid will become valid, the irrational will become rational. No amount of time can do that, brothers and sisters. No amount of time can turn falsity into truth. Even if the statement was rewritten as thus, given enough time, what we've never observed anything like will inevitably come to pass, it's still false. Because how can you possibly know? Note that we're talking about the time as the history of a particular contingent system in the world as we know it. Not time in its entirety from eternity past to eternity in the future. No. Okay? So how can anybody know that if that time lasts long enough, then something we've never seen before should come to pass? Again, natures are not creators or arbiters of existing things. Natures are contingent habits that are themselves arbitrated by a willful creator. So you have to know that he has the will to create something in the future, either through those natures or through other natures you know nothing of, or despite of all current natures and existing things. You have to know that, so you can say that in due time it shall come to pass. You don't have that. So no matter how high or long the gradual path, how high the mountain of probability that Dawkins assumes, or long the gradual path you assume to what you claim to be improbable gets to be, it cannot warrant any contingent event being the way that it is rather than otherwise. No matter for how long that lady with the wand you spoke of continues to shake the hundreds of detached pieces of the coach in a box or in a bag, no coach will ever come to form in that box, not even in 100 billion years, and not even if someone decided to take it on steps, because, by the way, this is also an informed decision, okay? The decision to take it gradually must have information underlying it so that one step would hold, then the other would build upon it, and the other would build upon it, etc., until the improbable comes to be. There has to be steps. Okay, now a knowing maker has to carefully and knowingly fix every part in its particular place with a particular order for that to happen. So quit trying to play this game, Dawkins, because it's not working. It never worked for you before and it never will. Wallahu musta'an wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.
قناة إقناع فيما نرجو.
سحابة خير أمطرت على أرض جرداء
تحمل من كل زوجين اثنين،
المؤمن والملحد،
الضال والمهتدي،
الموقن والشاك،
فأنبتت بما تحمله من ماء الحياة حيث نصوص الوحيين
ثمار اليقين في قلوب المؤمنين،
وصقلت بذات الماء قلوب المعاندين.